The courtroom atmosphere was unusually silent today. This was not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that settles heavily on the chest. Everyone present in the room knew that the decision about to be announced would not be written only on paper, but would leave its mark on someone's entire life. The people sitting on the wooden benches maintained straight postures, as if no one wanted to take the seriousness of this moment lightly. Every time the court clerk read even a single word, her voice echoed through the room, making the silence feel even deeper afterward. And standing within that silence was Evelyn Carter. There was no panic on her face, no tears in her eyes. She wore a simple light-colored dress, neither expensive nor plain. Her hair was neatly tied back, and her hands were calmly folded in front of her. If someone judged only by looking at her, they would never guess that this woman was losing her marriage in court. At that very moment, people often believe that when a woman loses a divorce, she breaks apart completely, but Evelyn did not break. She was simply silent. The judge sat upright in his chair and closed the file. His voice was completely neutral, as if delivering such decisions was nothing new to him. After reviewing all the evidence, he said, "The court rules in favor of the divorce petitioner." His words were direct and unmerciful. The respondent will receive no additional assets or settlement. The decision was against Evelyn. Normally, this is the moment when reactions erupt in a courtroom. Someone cries, someone shouts, someone begs the judge for reconsideration. But nothing happened here. Evelyn merely gave a slight nod, as if she had been prepared for this outcome all along. There were no tears in her eyes, only a strange sense of steadiness, the kind that belongs to people who have already made peace with their decision internally. She did not even look toward her lawyer, as if reassurance was something she no longer needed. On the other side stood her husband. There was a smile on his face, the kind that appears after a victory. His suit fit perfectly, his tie neatly aligned, and his eyes carried the certainty of a man who believed everything was under his control. He adjusted his collar slightly and glanced at his lawyer as if to say, "It's done." For him, this was merely a legal process, a burden lifted, a woman who, in his mind, had never truly been on his level. Evelyn's silence did not surprise him. In fact, it strengthened his belief. She has nothing to say, he thought to himself. Some people seated in the courtroom looked at Evelyn with pity. To them, she was a weak woman who couldn't even claim her own rights. Others assumed she had simply accepted defeat, and some were quietly confused by how someone could remain so composed after such a major loss. No one considered the possibility that this silence was not helplessness, but choice. The judge announced the conclusion of the proceedings. The court clerk began reading formal instructions. Files were closed, people stood up, and the courtroom slowly returned to its routine. The case was officially over. Evelyn took a deep breath and walked toward the courtroom doors. Her steps were neither rushed nor slow, perfectly balanced. There was no embarrassment on her face, no anger. If anything, there was a quiet sense of relief, as if she had finally been freed from a burden. Behind her, her husband was speaking to his lawyer. His words carried a light tone of mockery. "She didn't even fight," he said. "I thought she'd try harder." To him, these words meant nothing, but if anyone had closely observed Evelyn's face at that moment, they might have sensed that this story was far from over. This was merely the end of one chapter, and only on the surface. As Evelyn stepped outside the courtroom, a cool breeze brushed against her face. She paused briefly and looked up at the sky. People believed she had lost everything: her marriage, her dignity, her future security. But the truth was that Evelyn had only let go of one thing, a relationship that no longer belonged to her life. What she still possessed was something no courtroom ruling could ever take away. And those who were present in the courtroom that day had no idea that the woman walking away in silence was leaving far more behind and carrying far more with her than anyone could imagine When the hidden billionaire secret finally comes to light, that very silence will become a shock no one had ever anticipated. 7 years earlier, Evelyn Carter's life looked nothing like the assumptions people would later make about her. There were no signs of excess, no visible markers of privilege, no clues that suggested she came from anything other than an ordinary background. She lived quietly, worked steadily, and kept her world intentionally small. That was not an accident. It was a choice she had learned to make, long before she ever walked into a courtroom. Evelyn had been raised to understand that wealth, when exposed, had a way of distorting everything it touched. Her family had never lived in the spotlight. Their influence existed behind layers of privacy, protected by legal structures, and deliberate distance from public recognition. From a young age, Evelyn learned that the loudest displays of power were often the weakest, and that true control came from being underestimated. It was a lesson that shaped her instincts, her habits, and eventually her marriage. When she met her future husband, he appeared to be the opposite of everything she was. He was confident, vocal, and ambitious. He spoke about success as if it was something that needed to be constantly proven and publicly affirmed. He believed in momentum, in visibility, in the idea that respect was something you earned by asserting yourself. Evelyn found his certainty intriguing at first. It felt reassuring to be with someone so sure of his direction. In the beginning, their differences seemed complementary. He admired her calm. She appreciated his drive. He liked that she listened. She liked that he spoke with purpose. What neither of them realized was that they were interpreting the same traits in entirely different ways. Where Evelyn saw balance, he saw compliance. Where she practiced restraint, he assumed limitation. As their relationship deepened, those interpretations hardened into beliefs. He began to view himself as the provider, the anchor, the one whose success defined their shared future. Evelyn never corrected him, not Beck. Oars, it was true, but because correcting him would have shifted the foundation of their relationship into something she never wanted it to be. She wanted to be valued for who she was, not what she had access to, so she stayed quiet. Their marriage followed, a predictable rhythm. He worked long hours, chased promotions, and talked endlessly about growth. Evelyn adjusted her life around his schedule. She supported him emotionally, managed the unseen details of their home, and maintained a steady presence in his increasingly hectic world. To him, these contributions were invisible. They didn't come with titles or paychecks, so they didn't register as value. Over time, subtle changes crept in. His tone shifted, his expectations grew. He began to speak as if her role in his life was secondary to his ambitions. Comments that once sounded casual started to carry an edge. Questions about her plans became criticisms about her lack of direction. Evelyn noticed, but she did not confront him. She had learned long ago that not every misunderstanding could be corrected through explanation. What he interpreted as passivity was, in reality, Evelyn's growing awareness that they were living in two different realities. She understood that he measured worth externally, while she understood it internally. The gap between those perspectives widened with every unspoken assumption. When the first serious argument happened, it wasn't about money or infidelity. It was about respect. He accused her of not contributing enough, of benefiting from his success without matching his effort. Evelyn listened, without interrupting. She absorbed every word, not because she agreed, but because she wanted to understand how he truly saw her. What she heard confirmed what she had quietly feared. He loved the idea of being needed more than he loved her as an equal. The conversation ended without resolution. He assumed his point had been made. Evelyn realized something had been broken. From that moment on, the marriage began to unravel slowly. There were fewer shared moments, fewer attempts at understanding. He grew more dismissive, she grew more distant. The emotional labor she had carried for years began to feel heavier, not because it was difficult, but because it was no longer appreciated. When divorce was finally mentioned, it came from him. He framed it as a practical decision, a necessary step forward. Evelyn did not argue. She did not negotiate. She asked only one question, whether he was certain. His answer was immediate. That certainty told her everything she needed to know. The legal process unfolded quickly. He hired aggressive attorneys, confident that the outcome would favor him. Evelyn cooperated fully. She disclosed what was required, and nothing more. She did not challenge his claims, or inflate her needs. To the legal system, she appeared exactly as he had always described her, financially unremarkable, emotionally restrained, and willing to walk away quietly. What no one understood, not the lawyers, not the court, and certainly not her husband, was that Evelyn's silence was not the result of defeat. It was the product of clarity. She had already mourned the marriage, long before the paperwork began. By the time she stepped into the courtroom, she was not fighting for something she had already let go of. To him, the divorce was about winning. To her, it was about ending something that no longer reflected who she was. That difference in intention would soon matter more than either of them could imagine. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, everything unfolded exactly the way her husband had expected. Each court date reinforced his confidence. Each signed document felt like another quiet victory. To him, the case was clean, simple, and almost boring. There were no dramatic disputes, no heated arguments, no shocking claims, just paperwork, signatures, and a wife who said almost nothing. That silence became the story. Everyone told themselves. In the courtroom, Evelyn Carter was spoken about, more than she spoke for herself. Lawyers discussed her finances, her lifestyle, her lack of contribution. Numbers were mentioned, assumptions were made, and conclusions were drawn without resistance. Every time her attorney was given an opportunity to challenge a claim, he declined politely. That only strengthened the narrative forming in the room. She had nothing to fight with, and nothing to fig. HT4. Her husband leaned into that belief. With every hearing, his posture grew more relaxed, his tone more casual. He began to treat the process less like a legal matter, and more like a formality. He was simply waiting to finish. He answered questions quickly, confidently, sometimes with a hint of sarcasm. He knew how this would end. He always had. When the judge asked Evelyn if she wished to contest any of the statements made about her finances or role in the marriage, she responded calmly, "No, Your Honor. No explanation, no clarification, just a simple refusal to engage." That response echoed through the courtroom, louder than any argument could have. People assumed it meant acceptance. Some interpreted it as resignation. Others saw it as proof that she had always depended on her husband and now had nowhere else to turn. A few even pitied her, whispering quietly among themselves about how unfortunate it was to watch someone lose so completely. Her husband noticed those looks and welcomed them. They confirmed his version of reality. He had always believed that power was visible, that those who had something to protect would fight. Evelyn's refusal to do so only validated his sense of superiority. At one point, while reviewing asset disclosures, he couldn't help himself. He let out a quiet laugh and shook his head. "There's really nothing here," he said to his attorney, not bothering to lower his voice. "I told you, this would be easy." Evelyn sat, just a few feet away. She heard every word. She didn't react. That lack of reaction unsettled some people in the room, though no one could quite explain why. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't fear, it was something else, something controlled, but control without context is often mistaken for emptiness, and that was exactly the mistake being made. As the hearings progressed, her husband grew bolder. He spoke openly about moving on, about rebuilding his life, about how clean breaks were healthier for everyone involved. Once, during a brief recess, he even joked to someone nearby that at least there would be no messy settlement to deal with. "She knows when she's beaten," he said with a smile. Evelyn remained composed through it all. She listened carefully, not to respond, but to observe. Every comment, every assumption, every careless remark painted a clearer picture of how completely she had been misunderstood. And with that understanding came an unexpected sense of calm. The less they expected from her, the easier it became to let the truth remain where it belonged. For now, her attorney followed her lead. He never interrupted unnecessarily. He never dramatized her position. He allowed the court to see exactly what it expected to see: a quiet woman, a lost divorce, a closed case. By the time the final hearing approached, the outcome felt inevitable to everyone except Evelyn. Her husband walked into the courtroom that day with the ease of someone finishing an obligation, not ending a marriage. He signed documents without hesitation, sometimes without fully reading them. He trusted the narrative he had helped create. He trusted his assumptions more than he trusted curiosity. Evelyn watched silently as each decision was recorded, each page stamped, each form finalized. She did not rush the process. She did not delay it either. She simply allowed it to unfold. To everyone else, she was losing. What they could not see was that she was choosing exactly when not to speak. Because some truths, when revealed too early, are ignored, and some silences, when held long enough, become impossible to dismiss. The courtroom believed it was witnessing the end of a story. In reality, it was only watching the final moments before a reality it was completely unprepared for would surface. The final hearing began, like all the others, quiet, procedural, almost routine. The judge reviewed the case file once more, flipping through pages that summarized months of assumptions, disclosures, and conclusions. To anyone watching, this looked like the end of a straightforward divorce. No disputes left unresolved, no surprises expected, just a formal closing of the record. Evelyn Carter stood in the same place she had stood before, calm and still. Her expression hadn't changed since the first hearing. If anything, she looked lighter now, as though the weight of uncertainty had already lifted. She listened as the judge summarized the outcome, high tone measured, and final. The divorce was granted. The settlement favored her husband. Evelyn would leave, with nothing beyond what she had entered the marriage with. The words landed exactly as everyone expected them to. Her husband smiled. It was subtle at first, a small curl at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile that comes from confirmation rather than joy. He glanced briefly at Evelyn, then away, already mentally stepping into the life he believed awaited him. This chapter, in his mind, was closed. The judge paused before moving on to the final paperwork. He glanced at Evelyn's attorney, who stood slowly. "Your Honor," the attorney said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Before the court concludes, we request that one final document be entered into the record." The request was unexpected. The judge raised an eyebrow slightly. "Is this document relevant to the divorce settlement?" "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied. "It concerns the respondent's financial independence and clarifies the court's ruling regarding support and dependency." Her husband frowned. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered, "What is this about?" His attorney shrugged, slightly, equally confused. The document was handed to the judge. It was not thick or dramatic, just a neatly prepared folder, sealed and formal. The judge opened it and began to read. Seconds passed, then more. The courtroom, which had been murmuring softly, fell silent again. This time, the silence. CE felt different, focused, expectant. The judge's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable. He stopped reading, adjusted his glasses, and looked up. "Miss Carter," he said, addressing Evelyn directly, "can you confirm that the information contained in this document is accurate?" "Yes, Your Honor," Evelyn replied. Her husband straightened in his seat. "What information?" he asked, unable to keep the irritation out of his voice. The judge turned his gaze toward him. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "this document confirms that Miss Carter is the sole beneficiary of a private financial trust." Her husband laughed softly. "A trust," he said dismissively. "That doesn't change anything. Plenty of people have trusts." The judge looked back down at the page. "This is not a typical trust," he said. The laughter stopped. The judge continued, his voice steady, but now carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "The trust in question controls a network of private assets and holdings valued in excess of several $100 billion. The words hung in the air. Her husband blinked. "That's not possible," he said quickly. "There has to be a mistake." The judge did not respond immediately. He turned another page. "The valuation is current," the judge continued, and independently verified. "The total estimated value exceeds $1 trillion. For a moment, no one spoke. Her husband's face drained of color. He stared at the judge, then at the document, then at Evelyn, as if waiting for someone to laugh and admit it was a misunderstanding. Evelyn did none of those things. "This information," the judge said, "confirms that Miss Carter is not financially dependent on the petitioner in any capacity. Therefore, the court acknowledges her decision to waive all claims without prejudice." Her husband stood abruptly. "This is insane," he said, his voice shaking. "Why wasn't this disclosed earlier?" Evelyn finally looked at him directly. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but clear. "You never asked." The courtroom reacted, all at once. A sharp intake of breath, murmurs, heads turning. The story everyone thought they understood, shattered in seconds. Her husband shook his head, backing away, as if the distance might help him regain control. "You let me believe. I let you believe what you wanted," Evelyn replied. "I never said I had nothing. You decided that—" The judge raised a hand, restoring order. "Mr. Carter," he said firmly, "the court finds no evidence of misrepresentation. Miss Carter made no false claims and requested no support. Her personal wealth was irrelevant to the settlement." She agreed to. Her husband's lawyer leaned toward him urgently, whispering something he barely heard. The judge concluded, "The divorce is finalized as recorded. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck. Evelyn exhaled, slowly. Her husband remained frozen, surrounded by a reality he had never considered. Red. The assumptions that had carried him through the process collapsed in a single moment. The quiet woman he had dismissed had never been powerless. She had simply chosen not to correct him. Evelyn turned and walked toward the exit. her steps steady, her expression unchanged. Behind her, the courtroom buzzed with disbelief. The truth was finally out, and nothing would ever look the same again. The courtroom did not empty. All at once, after the gavel struck, people lingered, whispering in low voices, stealing glances at Evelyn Carter, and then quickly looking away, as if afraid of being noticed. What had moments ago felt like an ordinary divorce case had transformed into something else entirely, a moment people knew they would remember. Evelyn did not stay to witness the reactions. She walked out calmly, the same way she had walked in, her pace unhurried, her posture steady. Outside, the hallway felt brighter, louder, almost intrusive. After the intensity of the courtroom, she paused for a brief moment, inhaled deeply, and then continued forward, without looking back. Inside, her husband remained standing, near the counsel table, stunned. The confident man who had walked into court that morning no longer existed. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched, his mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. Conversations buzzed around him, but none of the words seemed to reach his ears. Did you hear that? A trillion. How did he not know? Each whisper felt like a blow. His attorney tugged gently at his sleeve, urging him to sit down, to regain composure, but he barely registered it. His eyes were fixed on the courtroom doors through which Evelyn had disappeared. For years he had believed. He understood her completely. He had reduced her to a role. He found comfortable, quiet, dependent, unremarkable, and now that image had shattered so completely that he could barely recognize his own reflection in it. As he finally sank into his chair, reality began to press in. This was not something he could laugh off later with friends. This was not a story he could spin to preserve his pride. Everyone in that room had seen it happen. They had seen the shift. They had seen him lose control without a word being raised against him. Outside the courthouse, news of the revelation traveled faster than Evelyn ever could. Lawyers talked, clerks texted, observers shared what they had witnessed. By the end of the day, the story had taken on a life of its own, not with Evelyn at the center, but with him, the man who thought he had won everything, only to realize he had understood nothing. At home that night, he sat alone, replaying the scene again and again. Evelyn's silence haunted him, not because it felt cruel, but because it felt deliberate. He remembered how often he had spoken over her, dismissed her thoughts, assumed her agreement. In hindsight, those moments no longer felt like victories. They felt like warnings he had ignored. He opened his laptop, searching aimlessly for information. He didn't know what to do with articles about hidden wealth, private trusts, old money families. Each discovery made the truth harder to escape. Evelyn had not lived simply because she had to. She had done so because she chose to, and he had mistaken that choice for weakness. The realization was unbearable. For the first time, he questioned his version of events, not just the divorce, but the marriage itself. Had he ever really known her? Had he ever tried? The answer, when it came, was devastatingly clear. Meanwhile, Evelyn's life remained unchanged in the ways that mattered. She returned to her routine quietly, without announcements or explanations. No interviews, no statements. The wealth attached to her name stayed where it had always been, managed, distant, controlled. She did not feel the need to justify herself to anyone who had already judged her incorrectly. The contrast was stark. Her husband's world shrank as hers remained steady. Where he felt exposed, she felt protected. Where he felt mocked, She felt indifferent. The power dynamic he had relied on for years had not flipped. It had evaporated. Days later, when the reality fully settled, he understood something. He wished he had learned sooner. The courtroom had not taken anything from him that day. It had simply revealed what he had already lost through arrogance and assumption. Evelyn's silence had not been weakness. It had been restraint, and that restraint, once revealed, left him facing the most uncomfortable truth. Of all, the divorce had not cost him a fortune. It had cost him the illusion of superiority he had built his life upon. In the weeks that followed, the story refused to fade. It moved quietly at first, passed between legal circles and private conversations, but its weight grew. With every retelling, people weren't just shocked by the number attached to Evelyn Carter's name. They were unsettled by how easily they had believed she was powerless. The realization forced many to look inward, to question how often they had mistaken silence for absence. Evelyn, however, remained untouched by the noise. Her days continued, as they always had. She woke early, followed her routines, and kept her world deliberately narrow. Wealth had never been the center of her life, and it wasn't about to become one now. The trust that bore her family's name had existed long before her marriage and would exist long after it. It was not a reward. It was simply a responsibility she managed with care and distance. Her upbringing had prepared her for moments like this, though she had never expected one to unfold in a courtroom. She had grown up watching powerful people lose themselves, chasing validation, watched how money distorted relationships and revealed insecurities. From an early age, she learned that the safest position was not dominance, but detachment. That lesson had shaped every choice she made, including the one to walk away quietly when her marriage no longer reflected mutual respect. Her husband's reaction unfolded in sharp contrast. The more the truth settled in, the more fragile his confidence became. At work, conversations felt strained. Colleagues treated him differently, not with cruelty, but with curiosity that cut deeper than ridicule. He could sense the unspoken questions behind polite smiles. How could someone be so wrong about the person they shared their life with? At night, alone with his thoughts, the past replayed itself relentlessly. He remembered moments he had brushed aside. Evelyn's calm during conflicts, her lack of interest in competing, her refusal to engage in status games. What he once considered indifference now revealed itself as discipline. What he called simplicity now looked like intention. The imbalance between them had never been financial. It had been perceptual. He had needed to feel superior. She had never needed to feel anything at all. That difference defined everything. Friends offered advice he didn't want to hear. Some suggested he reach out, explain himself, apologize. Others told him to move on and protect what was left of his pride. He tried both paths in his mind, but neither brought relief. Any explanation sounded hollow. Any apology felt self-serving. For the first time, he understood that remorse did not guarantee forgiveness, and closure was not something another person owed him. Evelyn never contacted him, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. She had spent years being spoken over, defined by assumptions she did not create. The divorce had ended that chapter cleanly. Revisiting it would only reopen a dynamic she had deliberately closed. Silence, once again, was not avoidance. It was alignment. with her values. As time passed, the public version of the story simplified itself. Headlines focused on the shock. Commentators debated fairness. Speculation filled the gaps left by Evelyn's refusal to speak, but none of it mattered to her. The truth did not require defense. It existed, complete and intact, regardless of who understood it. What lingered instead was the lesson. Those who had witnessed the case began to talk about it differently, not as a tale of hidden wealth, but as a reminder of how dangerous unchecked assumptions could be, how arrogance could blind even the most confident person, how composure, when misunderstood, could be mistaken for defeat. Evelyn returned to her life with the same quiet authority she had always carried. The courtroom had not given her power, and it had not taken it away. It had simply revealed it to those who had never thought to look. Her husband was left with something far heavier than regret. He was left with awareness of his own limitations, of the cost of underestimating someone who chose not to announce themselves. And that awareness followed him everywhere, because some losses are not measured in money or assets, but in the moment. You realize that the person you dismissed had been standing above your assumptions all along. The story stayed with people, not because of the scale of the wealth involved, but because of how quietly it had been revealed. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic confrontation, no moment where Evelyn Carter raised her voice or demanded recognition. The impact came from contrast, the sharp difference between what everyone assumed and what had always been true. That contrast forced an uncomfortable reflection on how easily perception becomes belief. Many who followed the case began to recognize pieces of themselves in it. They remembered times they had underestimated someone because they were soft-spoken or overlooked a person who didn't demand attention. They recalled conversations where confidence had been mistaken for competence and silence had been misread as surrender. Evelyn's story exposed how common that mistake was and how costly it could be. What made the moment powerful was not that she had won in the end, but that she never tried to. There was no revenge in her actions, no desire to humiliate. The truth emerged, simply because accuracy mattered, not because she needed validation. That distinction unsettled people more than any dramatic outburst could have. It challenged the idea that strength must be performative to be real. Her husband's reaction became a cautionary example. He had not been cruel in obvious ways. He had not shouted or threatened. Instead, he had relied on assumptions, quiet ones, polite ones, socially acceptable ones. He assumed leadership where there was partnership. He assumed dependency where there was independence. And because those assumptions went unchallenged, they hardened into certainty. That certainty had been his undoing. In hindsight, the signs had always been there. Evelyn's lack of interest in status, her refusal to compete, her calm during moments of conflict, these were not indicators of weakness. They were indicators of someone who did not measure themselves by comparison, but because he needed to feel superior, to feel secure. He never questioned the hierarchy he had created in his own mind. The courtroom stripped that hierarchy away without argument. Observers realized that Evelyn's silence had been misinterpreted because silence makes people uncomfortable. It creates space, and in that space, others project their fears, their expectations, their narratives. Her husband filled that space with assumptions that served him. The court simply corrected the record. The lesson that lingered was not about marriage or divorce. It was about attention, about how often people listen only long enough to confirm what they already believe, about how rarely they pause to ask questions that might disrupt their sense of control. Evelyn had never tried to control the narrative. She had trusted that truth did not need constant reinforcement. That belief had guided her through the marriage, the divorce, and the aftermath. It allowed her to walk away without bitterness, without spectacle, without needing to be understood by everyone. Her husband, by contrast, had built his identity on being seen a certain way. When that image collapsed, there was nothing solid underneath it. The loss he experienced was not financial, it was existential. He was forced to confront the reality that his confidence had been built on comparison rather than self-knowledge. That realization marked a turning point. He could no longer rely on the version of himself he had performed for years. Whether he chose to grow from that awareness or retreat into resentment was something only time would reveal. But the moment itself could not be undone. For those watching from the outside, the story became a reminder to reconsider how they evaluate others, to notice who speaks and who listens, who dominates conversations and who observes, who demands recognition and who operates without it. The case offered no easy moral, no clean division between hero and villain. Instead, it presented a mirror. Evelyn did not emerge as a symbol because she sought to be one. She became one because she embodied a truth people recognized but rarely acknowledged, that power does not always announce itself, and that dignity does not require applause. Her composure challenged the belief that winning must be loud and that losing must be visible. In the end, what stunned everyone was not the billionaire's secret. It was the realization that the outcome had never been in question. The divorce had simply revealed what had always existed beneath the surface, two fundamentally different ways of moving through the world. One sought control through dominance and assumption, the other through restraint and clarity, and when those two approaches finally collided, only one of them remained intact. That was the lesson people carried with them, long after the courtroom emptied and the whispers faded. Not every victory looks like a triumph, and not every silence is a defeat. Sometimes the most decisive moments happen without confrontation at all, when truth is allowed to stand on its own and everything else quietly falls away. The courtroom eventually returned to its usual rhythm. New cases replaced old ones. New voices filled the space where astonishment had once hung in the air, and the benches bore witness to other lives unraveling and rebuilding in quieter, more familiar ways. But for those who had been present that day, the memory lingered, not as gossip, but as something heavier, something that stayed long after the doors had closed. Evelyn Carter moved forward without ceremony. She did not reinvent herself, nor did she step into a spotlight that had never interested her. Her life remained grounded in intention rather than reaction. The wealth tied to her name continued to exist. In the background, man, aged with the same discipline. It always had been. It did not define her days. It did not dictate her identity. It was simply one part of a life shaped by choice, not circumstance. There were moments when people expected her to speak, to explain, to justify, to offer clarity to those who had misjudged her. She did none of those things, not out of spite, but because explanation would have served no purpose. Understanding, she knew, could not be forced. Those who were ready to see would see. Those who were not would continue, telling themselves comfortable versions of the story. Her husband's path was far less certain. The confidence that once carried him through rooms now felt fragile. Conversations required more thought. Certainty no longer came easily. He began to notice things he had ignored before. How often he spoke without listening, how quickly he dismissed what he could not categorize. The lesson followed him quietly, reshaping his interactions in ways he could neither explain nor escape. Time did what time always does. It softened edges, it dulled shock, but it did not erase truth. What remained was a subtle shift in awareness, for him and for those who had watched it unfold. The realization that silence can be a choice, not a weakness, that composure can coexist with power, that the absence of resistance does not always mean surrender. Evelyn had not walked away victorious in the way people expected. There were no raised arms, no declarations, no final words spoken for effect. Her victory, if it could be called that, was quieter and far more complete. She left with her dignity intact, her boundaries respected, and her sense of self undisturbed by the judgments of others. The story, when retold, often focused on the reveal, the billionaire's secret, the stunned courtroom, the man who laughed too soon. But those details were only the surface. Beneath them lay something more universal and far more unsettling, the danger of certainty built on assumption. Because the truth was never hidden to deceive. It was simply left where it belonged, untouched, until someone bothered to look. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. Not that Evelyn had said nothing when she lost the divorce, but that she never needed to say anything at all. The truth had always been there, patient and unmoved, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. In the end, the divorce did not define Evelyn Carter. It clarified her. It revealed the difference between visibility and value, between noise and substance, between dominance and dignity. And for those who witnessed it, the lesson was impossible to forget. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is remain exactly who they are, especially when the world expects them to break. And sometimes the silence that follows a loss is not emptiness, but completion.